Good morning. Welcome to our mini-series on Passover. Today's topic is the Jewish obsession with the Exodus. Passover is obviously all about the Exodus from Egypt. Something that happened, some of you might remember it, 3,300 years ago, plus a few years. So why are we talking about such an ancient event? And not only are we talking about it, but when you look in Jewish sources, there seems to be an obsession with it. Is it nostalgia? What we like to reminisce about events of the past? Not really, because who in the right mind becomes fixated on events that happened decades, even decades ago, centuries, millennia? So the classic approach to this is we have to learn lessons from history. But the flaw in that approach is, although if we would learn lessons from history, it would be a good thing, but the only lesson we learn from history, some wise person said, was that we don't learn any lessons from history. And if we do history, why do we have to go back 3,000 plus years? Why can't we just go back a few decades, a few centuries, something more in our experiences? So it's obvious there's more to it. I'm not saying it's wrong to learn lessons from history. We should learn lessons from history, but it's much more than that. And in Jewish mystical literature, Kabbalah and Hasidus, the idea is that you're not remembering something of the past. You are reliving that experience. You're reliving it, and you're recreating the energy that was generated at the time that this event occurred 3,300 years ago. There was an energy of liberation, a spiritual energy that brought about the Exodus. And we have an obligation by Jewish law to recapture that energy. And we recapture it by remembering and thereby reliving it and regenerating that energy. So that, briefly, is what the whole idea of remembering the Exodus. It's not just remembering, not just learning lessons from it, but it's recreating and regenerating the energy of the Exodus. And this is not just true about the Exodus, this is true about every event in the past that's recorded in the Torah. The Torah doesn't just want us to learn about history, which is a nice thing to do anyhow, but it's much more than that. We want to recreate those energies. So let's first survey what Judaism says about the Exodus in terms of our requirement to remember it and relive it. In the book of Deuteronomy, it says, in order to remember all the days of your life, the day when you went out of the land of Egypt. The word left is a typo. The day when you went out of the land of Egypt. To remember all the days of our life when we left the land of Egypt. Moreover, in the 10 Commandments, in the very first commandment, what does God say? I am the Lord your God who has taken you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. So the first thing God tells us when he communicates to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, the first thing he tells us, there was an exodus from Egypt. You can't find something more fundamental than that. The fact that it's included in the 10 Commandments, and it's the very first of the 10 Commandments, aligned with the very recognition that we believe in a God. There's a list of 34 commandments in the Torah. Of the 613, there's a list of 34 which the Torah explicitly connects to the Exodus. For example, all of the Jewish holidays, not just Passover. The the laws of honest weights and measures, to use a law from a totally different area, is connected to the exodus from Egypt. You have to follow this law as we were liberated from Egypt. The Torah seems to want to connect even the mitzvahs that are not explicitly connected to the exodus. It seems that all of Judaism is somehow related to the exodus. I never counted, but they say that the exodus is mentioned 50 times in the Torah. And numbers in Judaism have significance. 50, everyone knows what 50 years is. What do they call 50 years? A jubilee. What's a jubilee? Is that a joke? A jubilee is a Hebrew word, yovel. Yovel, servants would go free. It's a time of liberation. The number 50, the Torah was given after 50 days, and the Torah is seen as a source of liberation. That's the significance of 50. There's a Mishnah that we recite on the night of Passover at the Seder in the Haggadah. And it talks about the obligation to remember the Exodus every day. And the Mishnah says the Exodus from Egypt is mentioned, it should be mentioned at night. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I'm approximately 70 years old, and I was never privileged to prove, there's something missing over here, that you're supposed to mention the Exodus from Egypt at night, until Ben Zoma interpreted it homiletically, as it is stated, that you may remember the day you went out of the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. That's the verse that we read before. So if the Torah says the days of your life, and then it says all the days of your life, it comes to add nights as well. Not just during the daytime, but you're supposed to mention the Exodus every day and every night. The rabbis say, the other rabbis, no, not necessarily. The days of your life refers to the days in this world. All the days of your life is added to include the days of the Messiah in the Messianic age. That in the Messianic age, we will still have to remember the Exodus from Egypt. It'll still have significance. Yes?
So then will we be able to have the Seder during the day?
No, this is talking about every day of the year. Every single day of the year, not just Passover. Every day of the year, we're obligated to remember the Exodus. And then Ben Zoma added, not just every day, but every night. And the other authorities say, not just now, but even in the Messianic age, we will still mention the Exodus every single day. Now, the question you could ask is, so what's the difference between every single day and the night of Passover? That we'll tackle a little bit later. So the question is, why is it so fundamental? And to answer that question, we have to first preface another question that was asked. The very famous Jewish poet, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, was a friend of another great Jewish poet and Bible commentator known as the Ibn Ezra. They lived in the 11th, 12th century. So they asked the question, when God introduces himself, he says, I am the Lord your God. What does God say to introduce himself? People should know who was talking to them. I'm the God who took you out of the land of Egypt. Wouldn't it make more sense if God wants to impress upon us his greatness that he would say, I am the God who created heaven and earth? Because if you think about it, creating heaven and earth is a far greater feat than liberating someone from bondage. We can imagine any human being, a powerful tyrant who could enslave people and he could liberate them. Or a good leader could come and liberate slaves. That's something that's within human capability. But create heaven and earth, that's something we can't even conceive of creation of something out of nothing. So why doesn't the Torah say, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth? That was the question that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asked Ibn Ezra. And there are several answers to this question. And the writings are pretty vague, so there are different interpretations what their answer is. So I tried to combine their answers. Even Ezra says, it's to impress upon us that nature is not absolute, that God preceded and created nature. The fact that God could alter nature means that he transcends nature. And knowledge of God, and another point that even Ezra makes, knowledge of God from creation is for intellectuals. It's for philosophers, people who think philosophically. They have to come to the conclusion that there's a God who created heaven and earth. However, the Exodus is for everyone. You don't have to be a philosopher, a theologian. You don't have to be some brilliant thinker to see the miracles that happened during the Exodus from Egypt. And the Torah is speaking to normal people, not to philosophers. Philosophers are included, but that's not the main audience of the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself, in his famous classic work called the Kuzri, says the following, and there are two interpretations, so I combined the two. Number one is to focus on the uniqueness of the Jewish people. The Ten Commandments were addressed to the Jewish people, and God is coming to introduce himself vis-a-vis the people who were standing at Mount Sinai. So he's telling them, if he's talking about creation, that's universal. That's something everyone has to recognize. The Jewish people are no different. Here, God is coming to the Jewish people and saying, I have a special, unique relationship with you. I liberated you from slavery. The chinuch is very big, the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is very big on establishing the unique relationship God has with the Jewish people. And another thing he says, and it's another interpretation of what he says, and the Exodus they saw with their own eyes. No one saw creation. No one is able to see the creation of nothing into something, because if there was nothing, there's no one there to see it. So obviously you have to see it in your mind's eye. But the Exodus from Egypt was something everyone was able to see. That's why it has much more impact on us, because we relate to what our senses could access. And especially when it's the sense of vision, which makes things very real. The chinuch is a 13th, 14th century author, but no one knows for sure who the author is. But it was a book that was written to detail all 613 commandments. He details every single one of them, plus he gives a reason for the commandment where there is a reason, and plus he gives some basic laws about the commandments. So when he talks about the Exodus from Egypt, he says the following: it is a major foundation and strong pillar in our Torah and our faith, the Exodus, remembering the Exodus. Therefore, we always recite in our blessings and prayers a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt, because it is a conclusive sign and demonstration of the creation of the world, and that there is a God who existed before everything else, who desires and has the capability to do everything, who brings everything into existence, and who has the capacity to change things at will, at whichever time, as he did in Egypt. He then altered nature for our sake and performed novel signs great and mighty. This silences all who deny the creation. In other words, the remembering of the Exodus helps us recognize that God is the creator. So if we just say God is the creator, you have to then say, well, how do I know that? Maybe the world, the universe was always here. But when you see God is able to manipulate nature, that means he has control over it, and the world could not have always been here, because then God would not have had any control over the world. He then altered nature for our sake and performed novel signs great and mighty. This silences all who deny the creation, and it sustains belief in God's knowledge, and that his providence and ability extend to all, generally and specifically. Then we skip a few hundred years. Noam Elimelech is one of the greatest Hasidic masters, Rabbi Elimelech of Lizensk, whose yard site we just observed a few days ago. So he says, creation is an incomplete concept. Why did God create the world? Why does God need a world? What was his purpose? What was his objective? His objective was to give us the Torah. And when did the revelation at Mount Sinai really begin? It began at the Exodus. The Exodus was the first step in communicating to us the teachings of the Torah. And therefore, the Torah, in the Ten Commandments, when God introduces himself, he doesn't focus on creation, because creation by itself has no purpose. In fact, the Talmud says that when God created the world, it was tentative. If the Jewish people will embrace and accept the Torah, then the world will remain. If not, the world will be reverted to absolute nothingness. In other words, without the Torah, there is no creation. It doesn't exist. It's not even a theory that this creation. Creation has reality only because of the Torah, which began with the Exodus. That's why God is introducing himself, not with creation, but with the Exodus. Another Hasidic master, Divrei Chaim, says the following: God is with us even as we are in the Egyptian morass. In other words, God is telling us, do you think that I'm only with you when you're on a high spiritual level, when you're doing very well? I am with you even when you're in a terrible place like Egypt, not just physically, but spiritually. Even when you're in the spiritual dumps, I am your God, I am with you. So that gives us a little bit of comfort knowing that God never really abandons us. Sometimes it seems that way, and we sometimes feel abandoned, but we have to realize that God says, I am God, your God, no matter where you are. Even when you're in Egypt, I will always be able to be there for you and to take you out of that Egypt. A later Hasidic master, Rabbi Tzadok, says the following: through the Exodus, God's holiness became imprinted on them. They, the people who were there at Mount Sinai, became God's servants forever, and they could never truly assimilate. What he's saying is that God didn't just liberate us, he took us to be his servants. We became totally subordinated to God, that by our very nature, we have something that resists all types and all threats of assimilation. So God is telling us not just how great he is that he can take us out of Egypt. The other commentators say this proves to us God's greatness and he's a creator and he can manipulate creation. Rabbi Tzadok says it's here to tell us that God took us out of Egypt to be our master, that we are his servants, and we can't escape that. A Jew could try to run away from his essence, but ultimately it'll catch up with him or her.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
if God took us out to be his servants, then why did God make a covenantal offer to us? If we choose to be in covenant with him.
It's the only way we would understand that we are in a relationship with him.
Okay, very good.
I didn't hear.
It's our way of understanding, appreciating that we have that relationship. It's one thing to tell people, you're my servant, but people, if they don't agree with it, then that relationship is a very sterile relationship. So the covenant is what reinforces that relationship. And we constantly need reinforcement. But God establishes at the outset, this is a unique relationship. You are not free people. There's no such thing as freedom. Freedom is an illusion. If you're not a slave to one master, you will become a slave to another master. And Sinai gave us the option that we're not a slave to any other master in the world except for God. There are people, God gave us the free choice, so he gives us the ability to reject that and say, no, I'm not your servant, God. I'm independent. So what happens? That person becomes a slave to something else, either to other people, or to other values, to their addictions. You can't be a free person. You only have a choice what kind of master you choose. And the Exodus from Egypt establishes that we have the option of being God's servants. And that's the natural state of the Jewish person. And when a Jew deviates from that, that's unnatural. That's abnormal. So let's define further the idea of freedom and freedom from Egypt. Now, Egypt is it's not the original name, and in fact, Arabs don't call it Egypt. They call it Messer, I think. We call it Mitzrayim. What does the word Mitzrayim really mean? Mitzrayim comes from a root. Meitzar means something that is confined, to be within straits, confinement. So the whole idea of Mitzrayim is that you are not free. Not just because we were actually slaves there, but the whole land of Egypt is one that confines us. That whole experience limits us. And going out of Egypt means for us, as it did for the people then, is to be liberated from confinement. But confinement has many levels. The night of Passover, we're going to drink 4 cups of wine. If you can't drink wine with alcohol, you can drink grape juice. But they have to drink 4 cups. Why 4 cups? Because the Torah describes the Exodus using 4 expressions. 4 different expressions. I will liberate you, I will take you out, I will save you, I will take you as a nation, and you will know that I am God. So we have 4 expressions. Why 4 expressions? Because we drink 4 cups of wine, so that's circular reasoning. Why drink 4 cups of wine? Because of 4 expressions. But why 4 expressions? So one of the commentators says because what happened historically, the liberation of the Jews from Egypt occurred in 4 stages. The first stage that happened a half year before the Exodus, was the Jews were no longer slaves. They no longer had to do slave labor because this was in the middle of the 10 plagues, and the Egyptians had more important things to worry about than to enslave and force the Jews to work for them. So the torture of slavery, because it was back-breaking slave work, ceased a half year. Rosh Hashanah, actually, the Talmud says it happened. So it connects Rosh Hashanah to the Exodus as well. So that was the first stage. To extend it to ourselves, what does it mean that you're no longer a slave? You're free from torture, from not only physical but also emotional torture. We're living in an age where so many people are plagued with torture. They're in an emotional state of terrible inner turmoil and pain. And the first level of liberation is when you can free yourself from that, whether it's physical or emotional. But the Jews, even after they were freed from slave labor, they were still technically slaves. They had no identities. They were the chattel, the possessions of their overlords, of their masters. So that was the second form of liberation, that they were no longer identified as slaves. They had their own identity. What does it mean in terms of our own lives? It's a feeling there was a lack of independence that they were freed from. And that could refer to someone today who has an addiction. We all have addictions. Whether the addiction is drugs or the addiction is your cell phone. I could relate to that one better than the drugs. I hardly know a person who doesn't have some addiction that they can't rip themselves away from certain types of behaviors. And there are those who have it in a mild form, those who have it in a very serious form, a severe form, where it creates this terrible inner turmoil and emotional pain. But every one of us has this addiction, and we have to free ourselves from addictions. Then you have the third stage of the Exodus was they left Egypt. Even after they were no longer slaves, they no longer had anyone who was their master, but they still were prisoners in Egypt. What does that mean in contemporary terms? A person who's in prison can't exercise his or her potential. I remember I once visited a prisoner in Attica who was a doctor, psychiatrist, and he wanted to volunteer to help out with the medical needs of prisoners. They wouldn't let him. They wouldn't let him, maybe because they suspected him, maybe he would do something wrong. Whatever it is, here's a man who had tremendous potential. He also was a lawyer, and he also was getting his PhD in history. So he was a brilliant guy. and he couldn't exercise his potential. That's what prison is. Prison is not just confinement in a cell, it's confinement also of your abilities. You can't do what you're put in this world to do. And that's the freedom that the Jews experienced when they left Egypt, they left the prison. Or perhaps the same way in contemporary terms, it's what happened to Jews from the former Soviet Union. Even if they weren't actual prisoners in a prison, they were in a prison. They couldn't leave the country. And the feeling of freedom is an exhilarating thing, to know that you're no longer in prison, that you don't have those constraints on your potential. Yes?
Can I ask what his offense was?
What?
What offense he committed?
It's a long story.
And he was innocent.
No, he wasn't. He doesn't claim he was innocent. He probably, if he fought it in court, he probably would have gotten off, because it was a crazy thing. If you ask me some other time, I'll tell you. But then, even after the Jews left Egypt, they were still not totally free. Why? Because they didn't have a constitution. They didn't have a purpose in life. They didn't get the Torah yet. Not until what happened at Mount Sinai did the Jews experience total freedom. Because when a person is free, take the prisoners, many of whom I met when they were in prison, and they were released, and they got back into prison within a few days in some cases, and within other cases within a few years. The recidivism rate is extremely high. Why? Because when people are free and they don't have a purpose in life, they're going to go back to their state of imprisonment. Just because a person is given freedom, we cherish, in this country, we cherish freedom. Freedom is probably the most hallowed word in the lexicon of American citizens, that we enjoy freedom. But freedom is not an end. Freedom is a means. And the fact that we have freedom to practice our religion is the greatest gift that we have in this country. More than all the other freedoms that we have. The fact that we could be Jews, and no one tells us that we can't practice Judaism the way it was in the Soviet Union, for example. Because when you have a purpose in life, which is what the Torah gives us, then you are truly free. Because freedom means that you're free to express your inner self. You're in touch with your own soul's aspirations. See, as we all know from the other classes, we have a body and we have a soul. The body has its interests, the soul has its interests. If the body ignores the soul's interest, then you are not free, because that's who you really are. To use a simple analogy, if a little child tries to run into the street and you restrain the child to prevent the accident from happening, did you take away the child's freedom? No, because that child, deep down in that child's psyche that they are not even aware of, they don't want to die. They want to live. They don't want to be hit by a car. So you're actually providing the child with true freedom, because the child really wants to be healthy. The child doesn't realize that by crossing the street without looking, the child won't be very healthy. Same thing with us. When we do something contrary to what our soul wants, and we think, I'm free, I could do whatever I want. No, you're not free. You're a slave to your body and to your addictions, and your soul is now constrained. It's not able to express itself the way it wants to. So the last stage of freedom is where you're not just physically free, you're not just free to fulfill your potential, but your soul is free. And when your soul is free, you are totally free. And even if, God forbid, a person whose soul is free ends up in a Soviet prison, which is something that happened very, very often amongst the Hasidim, they used to say, it's an outright obligation for a real good Jew to spend time in Soviet prison, because that shows that he's really keeping his religion. If you want to really make the mitzvah even more beautiful, you go to prison twice. If you go to prison 3 times, that's showing off. That was amongst the Hasidim, they used to say that. Because most of the Hasidim in Russia ended up in prison or in Siberia, which is the same thing. So the 4 stages of freedom are 4 stages that cure you of your emotional torture, physical or emotional, takes away your addictions, it gives you independence, because when you're addicted, you're not independent. It allows you to fulfill your potential, and it also liberates your soul. There can't be anything more powerful and more significant than that concept of freedom. In the Haggadah, the opening paragraph of the Haggadah. What is the word Haggadah? Haggadah means telling the story of the Exodus. That's what we do Passover night. The focus of the night of Passover is telling the story. So we start off with the words, "This is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt." Sentence 2, "Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and join in celebrating the Pesach festival." Paragraph 3, sentence 3, "This year we are here, next year in Eretz Yisrael. This year we are slaves, next year free people." So there are several questions. The Rebbe once gave a long talk. I mentioned this a while ago. Every Pesach, the second night, the second Seder, at 1 a.m., the Rebbe would give a talk for 2-3 hours. At 1 a.m., after everyone drank at least 4 cups of wine. But many people would be dozing off. They couldn't help themselves. And the Rebbe, when he would speak, he would close his eyes. He didn't want to be distracted by the people who were sleeping. So there was one time where he gave about 5-6 talks, and each talk was just questions, and he didn't give the answers. After the end of this 5 or 6 talks, he gave one talk and answered all the questions and tied the whole Haggadah together. That was like a 3-hour deal. I was there once for that experience. So at any rate, some of the questions the Rebbe asks, why refer to the bread of affliction that we ate in the land of Egypt instead of the matzah we ate when we left Egypt? We ate matzah leaving Egypt. And that's the focus later on in the Haggadah, that we eat matzah because when the Jews left, they left in such haste that there was no time for the dough to rise, so we eat matzah. But here it says the matzah we ate in the land of Egypt. Question number 2. This is the opening paragraph of the Haggadah, which is about telling the story of the Exodus. It doesn't mention the Exodus in this paragraph. It doesn't even mention it. Number 3, why do we invite the hungry and the needy at this point? We're already sitting at the Seder, we already drank the first cup of wine, and at this point we're inviting hungry, needy people, and who hears it? If you're in your house celebrating the Seder. So it's obvious that this is not where you made the invitation. You're just repeating the invitation for some reason. And these 3 sentences seem to be disjointed. What's the connection between, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat, and this year we're here, next year we'll be free in Israel. There seems to be 3 disconnected sentences. So the Rebbe explains that when we talk about this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt, what it's really saying is that unfortunately, when we left Egypt, we were not totally free. We took some of the bread of affliction with us. We took some of the poverty, the impoverishment, the spiritual impoverishment, and the slave mentality with us when we left Egypt. And that's why the Exodus didn't last forever. And that's why there are needy and hungry people. Even though God said when you come out of Egypt, you'll come out with great wealth. So where are the poor people? Where did they come from if we were so rich? The answer is they didn't come out of Egypt even as they came out of Egypt. They took the matzah, the bread that symbolizes the bread of affliction, the taste of servitude, they took that with them out of Egypt. There's a famous paraphrase, a famous expression. You could take the Jew out of Mitzrayim, but you can't take the Mitzrayim out of the Jew. In other words, they went out with slave mentality because these were very primitive people, spiritually speaking. These were people who were steeped, as the great Kabbalist Arizal says, in 49 gates of impurity. Out of the 50 gates of impurity, they went down to the very bottom, if they would have tarried in Egypt a little bit longer, we're taught they would have sunk to the very nadir, the very depths of depravity, and they would have been lost forever. So God takes them out just in time. So it's like someone who comes out of a test and gets the passing mark. If the passing mark is 65, as it used to be, they come out with 65. You're not going to brag about, I got a 65, I passed. So that's how they came out of Egypt. So they took the bread of affliction, they took the servitude with them out of Egypt. And that's why we went back into exile, and we had to suffer with poverty, physical and spiritual poverty. But don't think that that's never going to end. This year, we might be here, but by celebrating Passover, that gives us the energy that we will eventually be fully liberated. So that's the introductory paragraph of the Haggadah. Now, at the Seder, we recline. And there are two reasons given for reclining, and they seem to be contradictory reasons. One reason is because in the olden days, in the Roman Empire, rich people, aristocratic people, would eat on couches, and they would recline as a symbol of freedom and wealth and comfort. So to simulate that kind of sense of freedom, we recline when we drink the 4 cups of wine, when we eat the matzah. That's one reason given. Another reason given is that when God took us out of Egypt, it says He didn't take them through the straight route, through the land of the Philistines, through Gaza, because He thought if we're not too far from Egypt, we'll see a war, we'll run right back into Egypt, because we're so fixated on being slaves, we would just run back to be slaves. As many prisoners will tell you that they found being in prison better than being free. They can't adjust to life outside, so they come back to prison willingly, or they don't really do very much to stay free. So it says that God took them in a circle. Vayasev, the Hebrew word for in a circle, is the same word used for reclining. So why do we recline? Because God saw the Jews were not really totally liberated. So then, didn't we say that we recline because it's an expression of freedom? And the answer is, how do you gain freedom? You gain freedom slowly but surely. You gain freedom not instantaneously. You can't just wave a magic wand and just turn people who have a slave mentality into free people. It's a process. And that's what happened at the Exodus. When the Jews came out of Egypt, they were raw, they were primitive, they were consumed with this notion that we're slaves. And in order for them to shed that slave mentality, they had to go through a process. They had to count 49 days to refine themselves. Then they got the Torah, and then they had relapses. And then 40 years later, they were able to reach the point where they were able to internalize freedom. That's when they entered into the land of Israel. And we're still working on it. Until Mashiach comes, we're still working on getting out of our slave mentality. Now, a member of this class, Eliyahu, we were sitting and learning the other day, and he made a very astute observation that ties in with what I'm just saying. When the Torah talks about the 4 expressions of liberation, it says, "What I'm going to take you unto me as a nation, and you will know God." That means the purpose of the Exodus was to bring the people to the point where they will have an awareness of God in their lives. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, which records what happens 40 years later, it says, "You shall know that there is a God, and take it to your heart." Now that's missing. Those few words are missing in the words at the time of the Exodus. Because at the time of the Exodus, the people were still affected by the slave mentality, so their knowledge would not be able to be translated into their hearts, into their feelings. It was distant, because to absorb it, to internalize it, was something that was beyond them. They didn't have that capacity. 40 years later, the people had matured to the point where God could expect them, you should know this day and take it to your heart. And that process has never ended. We're still waiting for the time when we will be able to have this knowledge of God in the Messianic age, and not just be a theoretical concept, academic, but it will be something that is translated into our emotions. We will feel the presence of God in our lives. And that's why when the book of Micha, one of the prophetic books, talks about the future redemption, it compares it to the Exodus. But it says something interesting. It says, like the days, plural, in which you left Egypt, I will show you wonders in the future. What do you mean the days that we left Egypt? We left Egypt in 1 minute. From the point when we were ready to leave, we crossed the border, it took 1 minute, 1 day to be free. Why does it use the plural? The days in which we left Egypt. So the Rebbe explains, because going out of Egypt is not a one-time thing. We're still going out of Egypt. Every day of our lives, every time we do a mitzvah, every time we pray, every time we study Torah, we are going out of Egypt, because it's a process. It's a process to go from a point where you barely understand what it means to be free, and then you keep on progressing in your ability to be free. And the ultimate freedom is when you're totally in sync with your soul's desires and needs. When the Jews left Egypt, they didn't have that. That's why it says the nation escaped. What does that mean? The nation escaped. So the physical understanding of that is, Moses always told Pharaoh, we want to go for 3 days. But that was not what happened. So after the 3 days, and they didn't return, Pharaoh realized that the Jews had fled. They absconded. And they were not coming back. So the question is asking the classic Hasidic work, the Tanya, you mean if Moses would have told Pharaoh, we want to go forever, he wouldn't have let them out after the 10 plagues? He would have granted them whatever they wanted. So why did they have to tell them a story that we're going for 3 days and they had to escape? So the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, says this was a reflection of a spiritual dynamic. They had to run out of Egypt, because if they took their time, they would have reverted back to becoming slaves in Egypt, because they were still very raw. They had to escape. And sometimes the practical application of this is, sometimes we have to deal with our negative traits, character traits, our animal souls traits, and we try to work on it, and we become depressed because we realize how deficient we are morally and spiritually. And it brings us down. It gives us a sense of despair. So what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to escape. Focus on your soul. Stop focusing on your weaknesses. Stop focusing on your body. Stop focusing on the negatives of your life. Yes, there's a time that you'll be able to refine the negatives, but don't focus on it. Focus on escaping, running away from evil, and focusing, putting your head and your whole being into something spiritual. And that way, indirectly, that will also help refine you, but it'll take away your preoccupation with your negatives, which leads to depression. One of the most important teachings of the Hasidic teachings is the negation of depression. Now, there's clinical depression that you have to be treated by a professional, but along with whatever treatment people get for depression, and people who are depressed just because their life is not going the way they want it to go, is don't focus on your negatives. Focus on your soul and do things that your soul wants, and that will give you joy. And when you're more healthy, more advanced spiritually, you will be able to focus on your negatives. There's a lot more to talk about that, but that's for another time. Now, we have a dispute that we covered before. When Mashiach comes, will we be mentioning the Exodus from Egypt? One opinion says no. Why not? What's the logic? The logic is, when Mashiach comes, the Exodus from the present exile will be so much greater, so much more powerful an experience, that the Exodus from Egypt will be like lighting a candle in broad daylight. No one's going to make a big fuss of the light that you get from a candle in broad daylight. It's light, but it's nothing compared to the daylight. The Messianic age will be broad daylight compared to the Exodus from Egypt, which is like lighting a candle. So there's no need to mention something that's so insignificant. So then why does the other opinion say that we will still mention the Exodus even then? Because there's a certain flavor that we get from resisting evil. In other words, when you have a desire to do something that you know is not right, cheating a little here, cheating a little there, whatever realm of life it may be, and you resist that temptation, that creates a tremendous source of pleasure for God. And you can't underestimate its power. Righteous people, the previous Rebbe once lamented the fact that he doesn't have the challenges of having to resist evil. He doesn't have the temptation. He said, I yearn for a time when I can actually feel the threat of evil, that I have to resist it. Righteous people, the true tzaddik, is someone who doesn't have an evil inclination. Their challenges are in doing good. In doing good itself, there are many directions you can go, and they have to go from one direction to another. So it's challenging, but it's not the same as the challenge to resist evil. And when Mashiach comes, we'll be like all righteous. We won't have a desire to do any evil. But we'll be missing the satisfaction and the flavor that we get from bending our desires and overcoming negative energy. So God will reward us and say, you know what? The Exodus from Egypt was an experience where you had to run away from evil. You will still have to remember that. You'll still get a little taste of that. It'll never go away completely, because that will give you completeness. Not only will you not have evil in the world, but you'll still have the flavor of resisting evil. The question is, yes?
When Mashiach comes, will we continue to celebrate Passover?
Yes. It'll be a minor holiday. Tisha B'Av will be the most major holiday, the day that the national day of mourning, the day that we lost the two temples and many other tragedies, will be transformed into the most joyous of holidays.
Did you not want to teach that there are only two holidays that we celebrate the world will come?
There are different sources that say that Purim and Hanukkah and Yom Kippur will still be prominent, but Pesach will not be. It'll be there, but not prominent. Sukkot will not be prominent. Rosh Hashanah will not be. So, because we're going to have so much greater holidays, yes?
Rabbi, Pesach is it's like our birth. And it's also when God said, you will be my nation.
So it'll still exist.
That's like,
but all the other...
celebrated is...
I didn't say it won't be celebrated, but it'll be minor compared to what we're going to have in the future, because Passover represents running away from evil. The Messianic age will be climbing in terms of the positive energy. And that is something that's like broad daylight compared to candlelight. So if you like Passover, it's not going to be taken away from you. You'll still have it. But the question is asked, we're obligated to remember the Exodus every single day of the year, and some say every night as well, which is what we do. We recite the Shema, which contains within it, the third paragraph talks about the Exodus. So what's the difference between that every day and Passover night? Every night you're supposed to remember the Exodus. So in what way is Passover any different? You know the question, why is this night different from all other nights? You know where that came from? There was a rabbi, I think it was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was knighted by the Queen. And when you're knighted by the Queen, there's certain things you have to say in Latin. And you know the story. Okay. And when he got to the time when he's supposed to say those words in Latin, he just he went blank and he couldn't remember those words. So he said, you know what, I'll say some words in Hebrew. The Queen will not know. So he said, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. And she looks at the person next to her and says, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" I don't know if it's a true story, but that's a story they tell. So why is this night different from all other nights? Every night of the year we're supposed to mention the Exodus, because every day, and every night, we're supposed to experience freedom. We're supposed to plug into the dynamic of freedom. So why is the night of Passover any different? So the Rebbe in his commentary on the Haggadah brings six differences, and I added on a seventh. Number one, some authorities say that every night you're supposed to remember the Exodus in your mind. You could verbalize it, but the main point is that in your mind you're aware of it. But the night of Passover, you have to vocalize it. You have to say the words. You have to read the Haggadah. You can't just read it with your eyes. You have to say the words. Another approach is taken that every night you can just mention it fleetingly. You just mention it quickly. You don't have to elaborate on it. Whereas the night of Passover, you have to tell the story. There's a difference between remembering something and telling a story. When you tell a story, you elaborate. And it says in the Haggadah that if you can do it all night, the more you do it, the more praiseworthy. And it tells the story of these 5 rabbis who did it, who spent all night telling the story. It's not just remembering it, it's telling the story. Another approach is that every night, you just have to mention it. The night of Passover, it's not just enough to tell the story, it has to be in response to a question. That's why we have the 4 questions. That's why we have the 4 sons. We're trying to get the children to ask questions. Judaism has a tremendous focus on the importance of asking questions, which you don't do enough of. You have to challenge me more. Questions are extremely important because a question is like a stepping stone to a higher level of understanding. And if you look at the Talmud is full of questions, thousands upon thousands of questions. And Judaism was never concerned and afraid of people asking questions. The Baal Shem Tov once said, "For every question I can give you an answer, for every answer I can ask another question." There's no limit to the number of questions. So the night of Passover, the focus is on when your son will ask you, when your child will ask you. It's a response to a challenge. That's what makes Passover different from every other night. A fourth explanation is there are 613 commandments in the Torah. It's not clear how do you define a commandment. If you read the Torah and you take every statement that sounds like it's a commandment, there's much more than 613. So there are certain ways of classifying what is a commandment and what is a statement. Maimonides has a book where he presents 14 ground rules determining what is a commandment and what is just a statement or an extension of another commandment. So Maimonides, when he lists the commandments, lists remembering the Exodus on the night of Passover as a commandment, but not about every day. He incorporates it in his code of law that you have to remember the Exodus every day and every night, but he doesn't list it amongst the 613 commandments. So some say it's because he considers it to be an extension of the Shema. Some say he considers it an extension of the night of Passover, but it's not an independent commandment. The night of Passover is an independent commandment. The sixth answer is, fifth answer, there are those who say that when Mashiach comes, we won't be mentioning the Exodus every night. Passover we will, but not every night, not every day and every night when Mashiach comes. Whereas the telling of the story on Passover will still continue in the Messianic age. Another sixth explanation is, every day you're supposed to mention it once. If you mention it once and then you mention it again, you didn't add anything. There's no mitzvah to keep on mentioning it. But the night of Passover, even if you did it for most of the night and you're still up for another 5 minutes, you still have an obligation to use that 5 minutes to tell the story. There's no limit to it, the night of Passover. Those are the 6 that the Rebbe brings in his commentary. But then I saw a 7th one, that is, that night of Passover, it's not enough just to mention it, to tell the story. You also have to praise God for it. And that's why in the Haggadah, after when we mention the Exodus, we also recite the Psalms of Hallel. These are the Psalms of praise for God. It's not enough just to tell the story. Sometimes telling the story itself is praise. Like on Purim, we say Hallel. And the Talmud says, because reading the Megillah is praise. When you tell the story, implicitly there's praise. But the night of Passover, it can't be implicit, it has to be explicit. You have to remember the Exodus, tell the story, and also conclude with, therefore I'm going to sing praise to God. So in short, the Exodus is an ongoing process. The ultimate conclusion of the Exodus will be when Mashiach comes. So every day we go out of Egypt. That's why we remember the Exodus every day. And it's the foundation of all of Judaism, because all of Judaism is about liberating our souls from our bodies' constraints. And to the extent that we experience that liberation, we are going out of our own modern-day Egypt. Any questions? Even after I said...
Yeah.
Oh, good. You saved the day.
Exodus is it's an attempt to escape from personal confinement in modern days.
Yes.
But if you live in the modern society and the previous times as well, how you can achieve the level of internal freedom if you live in a society? Because the society places certain rules on you, right? You depend on money, clothes, relationship, a lot of things. So how you can achieve the level of internal freedom in a modern society?
Okay, the answer to that is, number one, through the study of Torah and the practice of the mitzvot, of the commandments. Every time we do a mitzvah, which is God's commandment, that liberates us from things that confine us. But it's not enough. You also have to pray and focus on the idea of liberation and meditate on it. And to the extent that you not just do the right things that are liberating objectively, you have to become a subject of that liberation by meditating on it. It doesn't happen automatically. But even if the person just does the mitzvah without any feeling, that is liberating. But in order to feel the liberation process, you have to pray and meditate on it as well. And that's the thesis taken from the book called the Tanya. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. If I had gotten it correctly, you had mentioned that with the coming of the Mashiach, when Mashiach is here, that Pesach and Sukkot will become a minor holiday?
Yeah.
Okay. What about Matan Torah for Shavuot?
Same thing. Shavuos will also, yes,
So the
same thing.
Will
all become minor. The only ones that are exceptions to this, and there are different versions in the Midrash. Some say Hanukkah and Purim, some say Purim and Yom Kippurim, but so those are the three. And it's the surprising thing is that the two of the three are rabbinical holidays, Hanukkah and Purim, which dispels the incorrect notion that those are minor holidays. They're not minor, spiritually speaking, but they will be the ones that will still be prominent. But it's a mistake to think that the other holidays will not be observed, because when Mashiach comes, the Torah will not change. That's not a Jewish view, that Messianic age means we'll be liberated from the Torah. No, we will be liberated from the things that constrain us, and we'll be able to devote ourselves to Torah and its commandments without any distractions, without any impediments.
Isn't it true that Purim and Hanukkah are different iterations of Pesach, of liberation, of redemption?
All rabbinical holidays or commandments are connected to and rooted in biblical ones. So obviously a holiday of liberation like Purim takes its energy from Pesach. But even though it takes its energy from Pesach, it supersedes Pesach in many ways. Another question? Yeah.
One question.
Yeah, sure.
Why can the 4 cups of wine can be replaced with the 4 gulps?
4 gulps?
Yeah. That was like, why you have to have full glass of wine
If you,
in 4 of them instead of you could have 4 gulps of wine.
because drinking in Judaism, everything has its measurements. Matzah, you can't just eat nibble a piece of matzah. You have to eat the size of an olive, which would probably be, depends on how big the matzah is. If it's a machine-made matzah, those square matzahs, it would be close to a half of a matzah. If it's the handmade, that would be larger. It could be a third or a quarter of a matzah. Everything in Judaism has its fixed requirements. One of the things about Judaism is that God cares about details. In other cultures, and secularly, people say, well, who cares about the little details? It's the main idea. But God is found in the small things. It says there's a prophetic famous verse that God doesn't come in the tumult, he doesn't come in the noise, he comes very quietly. So the little details are important. When it says when you're supposed to drink, drinking is defined as drinking a certain amount. But it doesn't mean you have to drink, preferably you have to drink the whole cup within a few minutes. But if you can't drink the whole cup, drink at least a little more than half of the cup. And if you can't drink that much, get a very small cup that has about 3.5 ounces, and then drink more than half of it.
Rabbi,
Yes.
and instead of wine, you can drink grape.
Right, as long as it's kosher grape juice, yes. Actually, Kedem grape juice, which is the largest company, is made here in Western New York. And the one who supervises it, the Mashgiach, comes here very often on Shabbos. So, support your local vendors. Any questions on Zoom? Another question? On Zoom, anyone? Okay, so next week will be the second in the series of Passover. It'll be the other side of the Haggadah, I think. And the Sunday after that will be the practical part of Passover. We'll go into more of the physical things that we're supposed to do and their reasons.